The I
Today's episode is about the scandal of the diamond necklace. So before we get into the diamond necklace and what it means for Marie Antoinette, for Louis XVI, and for the French Revolution, tell us why you've chosen to kick off with the Marriage of Figaro and what is going on.
So the Marriage of Figaro, which if people haven't seen the play, they may have seen the opera, which was adapted by Mozart. And it tells the story of the wedding day of Figaro, who is the servant of a lecherous and arrogant Spanish count called Count Almaviva. And Figaro has just got married to Suzanne, who is the maid of the countess, the count's wife. And the count, who is, he makes Louis XV, who we had in the previous episode, look an absolute model of chastity. He wants to exercise the traditional droit de seigneur over Suzanne, so the right of a lord to bed whoever of his dependents he wants to. And all kinds of farcical shenanigans ensue, Dominic.
Love a farcical shenanigan.
Lots of cross-dressing, lots of hiding in cupboards, jumping out of windows, all kinds of things like that. But the plot ends up in a garden by night, and the Countess and Suzanne have kind of teamed up, and they've got this plan to basically publicly humiliate the Count and kind of get him to reform out of shame. And so to that end, they've swapped clothes so that the Count will mistake his wife, the Countess, for the maid, Suzanne, and vice versa. So it's a kind of classic French farce. And Figaro is worried that Suzanne is going to sleep with the Count, even though they've just got married, furious about it. He's very upset that the Count is behaving like this, understandably. And he also thinks that Suzanne is betraying him. And so he's assembled a large crowd to catch the Count and Suzanne in flagrante, because he thinks this is what's going to happen. But it all ends very happily.
Hurrah.
So because Suzanne is very indignant that Figaro wouldn't trust her, reveals the whole plot to him. The couple are reconciled. They have a kiss. The Count sees them kissing and thinks that Figaro is getting off with his wife, the Countess. Absolutely explodes, orders them all to be arrested. The crowd summoned by Figaro kind of assemble on the stage to with flaming torches and everything. At this point, the Countess emerges and reveals who she is. The Count realizes that he's been an absolute bounder, that he's been tricked, and there's a long pause, and then he falls to his knees and begs for forgiveness. In the opera, it's a stunningly beautiful moment. And the Countess does forgive him, and everyone is forgiven. And the last line of the plays, which is accompanied by music, is everything finishes with songs. So there's this idea that the class tensions and the iniquities of the aristocracy can be resolved with beautiful music.
But at the time, this play by Beaumarchais, 1784, incredibly controversial in France.
Unbelievably.
Because it was seen as so radical in that it was upturning the social order. There are lots of jokes and remarks and allusions to censorship or the way the justice system works, or the fear of being locked up in the Bastille. And it's now, when in Robert Darnton's brilliant book, The Revolutionary Temper, there's a whole chapter about the controversy about the Marriage of Figaro and how that foreshadows the revolution.
Yeah, and this is people listening to that praise, they were able to keep track of it. They may be wondering, how could a farce like this have this kind of incredible reputation? It had it at the time, and it had it in the revolution. So Danton, who we'll be coming to, one of the great revolutionary leaders, he says of it, it killed off the nobility. You might think actually it's the guillotine that does that, but Danton says, no, it's the Marriage of Figaro. And Napoleon says of the play, because we remember we did the episodes on the young Napoleon, didn't we? He loved to play.
Yeah.
And he said that, this is the revolution in action avant la révolution. This is what the revolution is going to become.
Right.
So the obvious question then, if it is as incendiary as contemporaries thought, how on earth did it come to be staged? And not only come to be staged, but become, unbelievably famous. It kind of in the way that a blockbusting Hollywood movie today might be, kind of going completely viral, copied, parodied. So, the fact that Mozart turns it into an opera within 2 years of it being premiered is a kind of indication of the cultural cachet that it has and the celebrity and indeed the notoriety. And the truth is that the difficulty of getting it on stage becomes part of Beaumarchais' marketing strategy. So he gives the finished script to the Comédie Française in 1781. And they say, yeah, this is brilliant. So it's the sequel to an earlier play that had also featured Figaro and the Count. So they're very keen to put it on, but it takes them 3 years to get on. And the reason for that is that the king is massively offended by it. He calls it detestable, and he repeatedly tries to ban it. But he reckons without two things, and one of them is Beaumarchais himself, who is an amazing figure, incredibly charismatic, extraordinary life. He'd been a royal agent in London. He'd been sent there to protect Madame du Barry from the Louis XV's mistress from a libelous pamphlet. He'd had all kinds of dealings with the Chevalier d'Eon, who is a diplomat who people think may even have been female, but kind of cross-dresser. And again, kind of cross-dressing is a kind of theme throughout The Marriage of Figaro. He ends up running guns to the Americans. He publishes the complete works of Voltaire, the great wit and philosophe. So an amazing guy, and is brilliant at self-publicity. And he uses the censorship battle to publicize the play. And he's able to do this by exploiting what we were talking about in the previous episode, that there are different factions in the court. And lots of the nobility who are opposed to the stuffiness of the king think it's very, very funny to get the play on. And one of the people who thinks it's funny to get the play on is the Queen herself,
so
Marie Antoinette,
who we talked about the last time, who's been behaving in a way that they think is not suitable for a queen because of her love of the kind of Rousseauist nature and simplicity and stuff.
Yeah.
And because she's kind of got a girlishness to her, a lightness, and French queens are meant to be heavy. And she thinks it's hilarious, doesn't she? She thinks it's really funny.
So Simon Sharma in Citizen says, the more outrageous the denunciations of the established order, the better the Queen liked it.
And that's because the people that she doesn't get on with at the court are the kind of rigid, formal, old guard kind of people.
Yeah.
And they're the kind of people, to some degree, who don't like this play and are being mocked by it, right? So she's naturally on the side of lightness and laughter, Tom.
Absolutely. And one of the king's brothers, so not the Comte de Provence, who is the kind of particularly embittered one, but the younger brother, the Comte d'Artois, who's very close to Marie Antoinette. I mean, he loves it as well. He pushes for it to be on. And so it becomes a massive, massive succès d'estime, not just among, the ordinary mass of theatre goers, but among the nobility. And again, Sharma, in his account of this, quotes an aristocrat, Henriette de Freudenstein, who describes all the aristocrats in the audience slapping themselves on their own cheeks, laughing at their own expense, and even worse, making others laugh too, a strange blindness.
So that's The Marriage of Figaro. But what nobody knows when they're laughing along, slapping their cheeks or whatever they're doing, what nobody knows is that in just a few weeks' time, there will begin an affair, scandal, that makes the story of The Marriage of Figaro, the farcical goings-on, look humdrum and unfunny and colourless by comparison. And this is the beginning of this tremendous scandal, the affair of the diamond necklace, Tom. And this kicks off, I think, am I right in saying, on the 11th of August, 1784, so just a few months later.
Yeah, so The Marriage of Figaro has premiered in the spring of 1784, and as you say, on the 11th of August, something happens, an event happens that weirdly echoes the kind of the climactic scene in The Marriage of Figaro, but kind of, as you said, ramps it up to a scandalous degree. So that evening, a milliner, a Parisian milliner called Nicole Leguet, who has been reduced to prostitution by the exactions of loan sharks, or so she says, is driven to Versailles. And to quote Jonathan Beckman, who is not only a historian but plays cricket with me in The Authors, but I'm not just saying this, has written a brilliant account of the whole scandal, How to Ruin a Queen. His description of Nicole: she was young, pretty and broke, and with her broad forehead, her straight chiselled nose and her small protuberant mouth, she resembled Dominic, no one so much as Marie Antoinette. So she gets driven to Versailles, and she's greeted there by a woman who calls herself the Vicomtesse de Valois, who tells Nicole something amazing, that the Queen has personally requested that her, Nicole, do the Queen a favour, and that in return Nicole will be given 15,000 livres, which is a lot of money for an impecunious prostitute. And more than that, because she's doing the Queen a favour, she will be given a title. The Vicomtesse de Valois says that from this point on, Nicole will be known as the Baronne d'Oliva, and that is Oliva, which is kind of an anagram of Valois, almost an anagram of Valois.
What are the chances?
So Nicole's suspicions are not aroused by this, it has to be said at the time. In fact, she's just incredibly bewildered, but I mean, the chance to have a title and lots of money.
Yeah.
I mean,
why wouldn't you take it?
What's not to like? So the next day, she stayed at Versailles. The next day, she's dressed in a kind of a plain but expensive white muslin dress. And people who heard our previous episodes will know that this is the kind of signature costume of Marie Antoinette herself. And she's given a demi bonnet which covers her face, but kind of enables people to see her lips. The Vicomtesse then hands, let's call her d'Oliva, because that's now her title, a tiny letter, and says that she is going to lead her into the park at Versailles, into one of the gardens, and that when she gets there, a noble seigneur will be waiting, and she's to hand this letter over, plus a rose, and that as she hands the letter and the rose over, she is to say to this seigneur, "You know what this means," and that's all she has to do.
Yeah.
And so at midnight, the Baronne d'Oliva, as she seems to have become, is taken out into the gardens. And she is told, as she's being led, that the Queen is watching her to make sure that she, does everything that the Queen has requested. So the Baronne d'Oliva, Nicole, aka Nicole the impecunious milliner, is standing in the gardens. There are kind of roses around, faint splashing of fountains in the distance, the stars are blazing in the sky. And not long afterwards, she sees a man approaching her. And this is a man in a long black cassock and a very kind of broad-brimmed floppy hat. He comes up to her, and the poor Baronne is terrified. She doesn't know who this person is. She's in the royal gardens. What's going on? But she kind of summons up her courage, and she hands over the rose. And she says, as she's been instructed to do, "You know what this means." She's just about to hand over the letter when there's suddenly a kind of an uproar, the torches in the distance, the sound of footsteps coming, and the Baronne's arm is grabbed, pulled into the bushes. It's the Vicomtesse who's got hold of her, hurries her back, takes her into her private quarters. And the Baronne d'Oliva, Nicole, apologizes that she hasn't been able to hand over the letter. But nobody seems to care. Instead, there's a big meal. The wine flows, and they go to bed. And in the morning, the Vicomtesse shows Nicole, the Baronne d'Oliva, a letter that she has received from Marie Antoinette. And she reads the letter out. "I'm very happy, my dear Countess, with the person you procured for me. She played her role to perfection." At this point, the Vicomtesse rips up the letter because she says it is not the kind of letter that one should carry around. So there is no evidence for any of this that's happened. The Vicomtesse then hands over a third of the fee that's been promised. And then the Baronne d'Oliva is driven back into Paris. From this point on, there is no further reference to her title. So she goes back to being Nicole, and there is no further money. And that seems to be the end of the matter. I mean, all very, very strange.
And this is from Nicole's own account, isn't it?
This is from Nicole. Well, it's from the account of her lawyer.
Yeah. Everything you're going to hear in this story comes from the accounts given by different lawyers who would publish, to make money, they would publish memoirs of what their clients had told them. And so,
but also, Dominic, to be fair, to try and get their clients off. As
yes,
we
of course.
See.
So this is Nicole's story.
Yeah.
So, Tom, a very kind of Mozart-friendly episode. This
it's very, very
the
Mozart.
Queen looking on, presumably a mysterious suitor in the darkness. The rose is handed over. All of this kind of thing.
I mean, it's made for an opera.
Yeah. Turn on the lights for us and tell us, first of all, who is that mysterious man in the cassock that the Queen appears to be giving a rose to?
Well, he is an amazingly important figure in the French noble hierarchy. He's a man called Louis de Rohan, and he is a scion of the grandest non-royal family in France. So he traces his lineage back to the one-time kings of Brittany. Mm-hmm. And so he has the Rohan have this phrase, roi ne puis prince ne daigne, Rohan suis. I cannot be king, I won't be a prince, I am Rohan.
Right.
So, it's better to be Rohan than to be a king or a prince.
Theoden would agree with that, Tom.
Of course. And in his role as a Rohan, he gets to inherit the bishopric of Strasbourg, which brings with it a cardinalate. So he becomes, in 1779, he inherits this, and he becomes the Cardinal de Rohan. And in his character, he's a very generous man, but in other ways, I mean, he's the kind of person who would very easily be taken in by a confidence trickster.
He's basically a character from a sort of Ben Jonson play or something, or a Molière play.
He's the kind of person who, if he got an email from someone saying, "I need your your passport details and £100,000, please send it here," he would do it. Yeah. So there was an abbé who'd been at the seminary with him, but when they were young, who remembered him as haughty, inconsiderate, unreasonable spendthrift, not very bright, fickle in his tastes and his friendships. But as I say, he does have two good qualities. He's very generous, and Dominic, he's an Anglophile.
Tremendous.
So these are positives.
Won't hear a word against him.
The problem is, though, that he has infuriated Marie Antoinette. Marie Antoinette hates him. And the reason for that is he'd gone to Vienna as ambassador. And because he's an Anglophile, he doesn't really like the Austrians. And he's always writing rude letters about Maria Theresa, Marie Antoinette's mother, to his confidants at Versailles. And one of them reads out something rude he said about Maria Theresa, and it gets back to Marie Antoinette. So she's very upset about this. And he's also gone around, when he comes back from Vienna, he's in Versailles, he loves a bit of gossip, he's not very bright. He goes around accusing Marie Antoinette of having an affair with the Comte d'Artois, the younger brother.
It's very reckless of him.
Yeah, it's mad. And also he says of the Queen, she displays a coquettishness that prepares the way for an accomplished lover to succeed with her. Mad.
Yeah, why would you...
So it's just...
he's foolish and he lets his tongue run away with him, clearly.
And people who've seen Dangerous Liaisons or read the book, the book by Leclos, written at exactly this period. I mean, this is exactly what's going on. It's people kind of gossiping about each other, overhearing it, reading letters that aren't meant for them, all this kind of thing. Yeah. So it's absolutely part of the climate. But the Cardinal de Rohan is not smart enough, really, to profit from it. And so he's distraught that he feels that now that Marie Antoinette is standing in the way of him getting the kind of promotion that he feels should be his right as a Rohan. So he'll do anything to try and get her back. And it's at this point that an impecunious woman with a sob story approaches him.
Yeah.
And this is a woman called Jeanne de la Motte. And she claims descent from the Valois, who are the traditional royal family who kind of gone extinct in the 16th century, been replaced by the Bourbons.
That's obviously just rubbish to appeal to the cardinal, isn't it? I mean, she's a swindler.
Well, this is the story. This is her story. And she approaches the cardinal for some charity, which the cardinal gives her. And almost certainly they have an affair.
You gonna? How does that work? I'd like some charity, please. Oh, my dear, I've got some charity upstairs. Come through.
I think that's exactly how it works.
Right.
I think that's So the cardinal is a notorious womanizer, as cardinals in the Ancien Regime tend to be.
They've got to be by law, surely.
So having done that, Lamotte then thinks, do you know what? I'm going to aim higher. And she wants to get quarters in Versailles. And so she persuades the cardinal to introduce her to one of the sisters of Louis XVI. And Lamotte has prepared for this moment very, very skillfully. So she's introduced to the sister of Louis XVI and she faints. She's kind of overcome. And whether this is staged or whether it's real, I mean, who knows? But the consequence of this is that she is seen as an unfortunate who has suffered terrible things and therefore needs to be helped. And this plays into the spirit of kind of sentimentality and sensibility that is absolutely kind of current and associated with Marie Antoinette and her kind of her vibe at Versailles. And so she gets these quarters, and she then she starts telling the cardinal that she's become great friends with the Queen herself.
I mean, the Queen does have her. You referred to in the last episode as her squad, so it's not that impossible. I mean, it could happen that she could become.
So the cardinal completely believes it, and Lamotte then starts saying, the only way to get to Marie Antoinette's heart is to buy her the most notorious necklace in France. It had been made by the court jewelers, BRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRR it's called kind of slave necklace because it looks like a kind of collar that a slave might wear. It consists of 647 diamonds, and these weigh 2,800 carats. So it is massively vulgar.
Yeah.
And so Jonathan Beckman describes it as grotesque and almost literally unbearable. It more resembled an item of chainmail or something a monk might wear in penitential self-chastisement than a coveted piece of jewelry.
It's a necklace that Donald Trump would buy for a lady of the night.
Yeah, for a porn star, perhaps, particularly if he was trying to quieten her. And unfortunately, the jewellers had never been able to give this to Madame du Barry because Louis XV had died. And so therefore, Madame du Barry had been chucked out of Versailles and wasn't in a position to buy it. And so they're stuck with this enormous bill and they need to sell it to someone. And so the obvious person is Marie Antoinette. So they keep saying, would Your Majesty, would you like to buy this? And it's not Marie Antoinette's style at all. I mean, it's kind of vulgar and
I think it's nature and simplicity and falling curls and no corset and all that stuff.
And on top of that, of course, it had been made for Madame du Barry. So it kind of had, it's not just vulgar. It has associations with kind of courtesans.
Yeah.
So absolutely not her. And also she has been warned by both her mother and her husband, the king, to stop displaying the bling, that it's not going down well. And also Monsieur Léonard, who we talked about, the hairdresser, he has been phasing jewels out from her hairstyle, going for the natural look, the flowers. So basically it's not her thing at all. She does not want it. So you might think, well, couldn't the cardinal have done some cursory research on this? And he'd have realised this is a mad thing. Marie Antoinette would never have wanted this necklace. But it's at this point, Dominic, that another figure steps into the story, and this is someone you're very keen on, isn't it? It's an Italian occultist called supposedly the Comte de Cagliostro.
Yeah, so his story is enough to take up multiple podcasts, but just to absolutely condense it, he told multiple different stories. Some of them he said he was the son of the master of the Knights of Malta, or a bigwig from Egypt, or from an Ottoman pasha. There were stories that he was 300 years old, that he was
even longer.
That he was 3,000
years old. 3,000 years old.
Yeah, stories that he'd been at the wedding in Cana in the Bible with Jesus and co. Basically, what seems to be the truth is that in reality, either he was born in Sicily, in the slums of Palermo, to a Jewish family, or he's the son of a coachman from Naples. We don't know which. He seems to have had time as an apprentice hairdresser. Which is a
lot of hairdressers behaving badly.
And then he basically becomes a swindler, professional charlatan. He goes around. He says he's dreamed up a special Egyptian form of Freemasonry. He's got a fake countess wife, and she sells the package basically to aristocratic ladies. And he seems to have come into contact with the cardinal in Strasbourg in 1781. And the cardinal, as you said, Tom, is an absolute flipping dupe. Yeah. I mean, that's what the whole thing about being a character from Molière play. And that he believes all this stuff about Freemasonry, on the occult. He believes that Cagliostro is an alchemist. And there are stories, aren't there? I think they're probably not true, but there are stories that Cagliostro was in on the plot and held seances and occult rituals to persuade Rohan, the Cardinal de Rohan, that the stuff about the necklace is true and that this is the way to Marie Antoinette's heart.
And of course, the thing is, always with confidence tricks, is that people have to want desperately to believe that what they're being told is the case. And it's not just the cardinal who wants to believe it; the jewelers do as well, because they want to recoup their investment. So November 1784. So this is a few months after the meeting in the gardens at Versailles. The cardinal gets a letter that has been signed Marie Antoinette de France, which is a signature she would never use because that's not diplomatic at all. And the cardinal, as a former diplomat, should have known this, but he doesn't.
Mm-hmm.
And in this letter, he gets informed that the cardinal is to acquire the necklace for the Queen and that the Queen will pay for it in 4 installments. So brilliant. The jewelers are delighted. The cardinal is delighted. This is his way back. So on the 29th of January 1785, the jewelers give the cardinal the necklace, A courier then arrives who claims to be from the Queen. The cardinal gives the necklace to this courier.
What a fool that cardinal is, Tom. I mean,
do you think it's the courier, Dominic? It's not.
No, who is it? Tell us who it is. Surprise us.
It's one of Lamotte's lovers.
Yeah, you astound me.
And he goes away. He gives it to Lamotte's husband. So that's very very Marquis de Sade. Lots of so the husband then breaks it up and he starts trying to fence the diamonds around Paris, but it's obviously dangerous to be doing it in Paris. So he then goes to London and starts doing it there. Meanwhile, of course, the jewelers are waiting for their money.
Yeah.
And the cardinal is waiting for signs of the Queen's favour that he's been promised. And he goes to court and he's kind of waiting to see the Queen with the necklace. Absolutely nothing. So early July, he thinks, I've got to see what's going on. So he sends Marie Antoinette a discreet note kind of saying, very much looking forward to seeing these, wink, wink, I've got you, nudge, nudge.
Yeah.
And Marie Antoinette thinks he's mad.
Yeah, of course.
Just disposes of the letter.
Of course.
Early in August, the jewelers are so desperate because they're now facing bankruptcy that they go to one of Marie Antoinette's ladies in waiting and say, look, where's this money that the Queen promised us? And they go to the Queen and she's got no idea that any of this has been going on. And Marie Antoinette leads the investigation personally. Understandably, she's appalled. I mean, she's completely innocent, and yet her good name has been consistently abused throughout the entire affair. And she has this kind of dramatic declaration of purpose. Hideous vices must be unmasked. The purple of a cardinal and the title of a prince have cloaked a money grabber, a fraudster who dares to compromise the wife of his sovereign. France and all of Europe shall know of it. And so she goes to the king, and the king issues orders that the cardinal be arrested. And so he is on the 15th of August, and he is arrested while he is celebrating. He's holding mass to celebrate the Ascension of the Virgin in the chapel at Versailles. He's in his full robes, smoke, bells, the works. In come the king's guards. He's arrested and taken off to the Bastille.
Crikey, Tom. What a story this is. Napoleon Bonaparte in later life said that the death of Marie Antoinette began at the trial of the diamond necklace conspirators. And Tom, that's a big claim from Napoleon. I mean, who am I to argue Napoleon?
Yeah.
Now, why would
he was there?
Why would one say that of something that on the surface seems a little bit inconsequential, and of course, in which the Queen is not really involved?
Right, because, I guess if people said, well, the cause of the French Revolution, a scandal about a necklace would be low down the list.
Very low down the list, yeah.
Bread riots, fiscal incompetence, all kinds of things, which we will be looking at in due course. I think that the answer to why it is so damaging to the Queen is the way that the scandal comes to be teased out and the way that it goes public.
Yeah.
So what happens is that all the main participants in the scandal, so the Cardinal, Nicole, aka the Baron d'Oliva, the Comte de Cagliostro, and of course de la Motte, they're all arrested and they're all brought to trial. And the trials that they have are open. So, the proceedings can be reported. And so this means that the Queen had said, all of France and Europe shall hear of this. This is exactly what happens, but it doesn't work to her advantage.
Well, just on that, so the openness, I think it's important that people get a sense of what an enormous appetite for news and gossip there is in Paris, in particular, in the 1780s. So we mentioned earlier Robert Darnton's brilliant book, The Revolutionary Temper, and he talks in that about how all the different lawyers, who we mentioned this, didn't we, in the first half, Tom, that the different lawyers of the various participants publish these, what they call these memoirs of the case, while the case is going on. And these would go through multiple editions, and they would sell tens of thousands of copies, and people would literally read them out in cafes, and people would gather to read them together. It's a kind of collective experience of the news and of rumour and gossip. And this case is the perfect story for all that. And it actually ties together all these anxieties and sort of fantasies about Marie Antoinette that have been gathering pace for more than a decade. Go on, Tom.
And I think a kind of parallel, the closest parallel I can think of that from modern times would be the way in which the failure of the marriage of Prince Charles and Diana kind of exploded. There was gossip about it. There were whisperings about it. There was talk about it. And then suddenly it was all brought out into the open. And there was this absolute kind of firestorm of obsession. And I think that is basically what happens. And it's devastating for Marie Antoinette and for the crown generally, because all the protagonists in various ways come to be exonerated. Three of them are legally exonerated.
Yeah.
4 of them are kind of basically exonerated before the bar of public opinion. And so the crown is left completely baffled and perplexed and wounded by this. So to go through the various, the participants in these trials, 3 of them, all of whom have been sent to the Bastille, and to be sent to the Bastille in this period, to go to the Bastille is the symbol of royal oppression. So it kind of immediately makes them heroes.
Yeah.
People are instinctively on their side. So the cardinal, when he goes to the Bastille, he is improbably cast as a kind of victim of royal oppression. He becomes the people's cardinal.
But the thing is, Simon Sharma says in Citizens, he actually moved into a specially furnished apartment outside the prison where he spent 9 months entertaining a stream of distinguished visitors. Oysters and champagne were laid on as a collation for guests, and the cardinal was allowed choice works from his library and a retinue of servants to help him overcome the hardships of incarceration.
But the image is that they're, dripping water and clanking chains and rats and straw and everything. But it's not at all like that.
Yeah.
And he says that he doesn't want the king to try it, basically because he doesn't trust the king. And so he says he wants to go to the Parlement de Paris. And the Parlement it's not a parliament. It's kind of like the High
Court, yeah.
And so he goes on court there. It's open. And his lawyer presents him as, a kind of Rousseau-esque figure. A figure, who has, an excess of candor. He's at one with nature.
Yeah.
He's not suited to the machinations of a corrupt and decadent court. He's Mother Nature's child,
right?
All that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And also, he just wanted to serve the Queen. It was his chivalrous duty.
He's been made a fool of in this story, but he's not a conspirator. I mean, he's not a criminal. So they were right.
So there is a measure of truth there
to acquit him. Yeah.
And so he does get acquitted. But the implications of this are devastating for Marie Antoinette, and Jonathan Beckman spells it out. Louis and Marie Antoinette could scarcely believe that the Parlement had, in effect, ruled that the Queen could be mistaken for the kind of woman who might arrange a midnight assignation, buy a ruinously expensive necklace without her husband's permission, and correspond in secret with a known roué.
Right, because if you're assuming that he could be easily fooled, then you're assuming that the possibility exists that she could have behaved like this. And we know, you and I know, and everybody who's read the books on her knows that she would never have behaved like this, but the French public have been primed to think that she might.
Yeah, absolutely. And he retires to Strasbourg, where he's greeted as a kind of, an oppressed innocent.
Yeah, yeah.
So that's him. Nicole, the Baronne d'Oliva, the account that we gave, as we said, is that's basically derives from the lawyer that she has, who essentially casts her as the kind of heroine of a novel. Yeah. And if it sounded like a novel, then I think, there may be kind of element of that. But I think the basic outline of what happened is true, but clearly it's been kind of slightly
I mean, she is a victim.
Enhanced.
She is a victim of it, really. She's
been
made a tool.
Yes.
She's been made a dupe of. Yeah.
And what makes people even more sympathetic is that in the Bastille she's given birth to a baby, so that makes her even more of a kind of sentimental heroine of a Rousseau novel. The Comte de Cagliostro, he has it. So in the Bastille, he continues to play the part of the magus, the man who is 3,000 years old. So there's this brilliant detail in the interrogation in the Bastille. He's asked, do you have any regrets about the life that you've led? And Cagliostro replies, yeah, I feel terrible about the assassination of Pompey the Great and my role in that. Pompey the Great, the great rival of Julius Caesar, had been killed 2,000 years before. So that's brilliant. But once he gets to his trial, he immediately switches round and suddenly casts himself as a kind of cool Enlightenment skeptic. And he gets asked by the prosecution lawyer, why do you say that you're thousands of years old? And he says, I'm not. I'm 37.
Yeah. So a lot of the stories about Cagliostro, to be fair, come from like pamphlets about him rather than things himself. So the Pompey the Great story, I mean, he probably either said it as a joke or didn't say it. I mean, anyway, he's a good character. I like him. And actually, the government account, which was by Barrister Courtager, and which was in it, he wrote a memoir, and it was the sort of government approved one, basically said Cagliostro had nothing to do with this at all. He was like dragged in as exciting window dressing, but he wasn't really. He was apparently in Lyon when the whole thing was taking place anyway. So he probably
difficult to know because there are so many kind of rival. He's such a fraud.
Yeah,
that I don't think you can trust anything that he says. So it's difficult to know. But I mean, anyway, he gets off. I mean, people agree that he doesn't have anything to do with it. As for Jeanne de la Motte, the confidence trickster, she is convicted. The evidence against her is overwhelming. I mean, she's basically banged to rights. But amazingly, even she wins public sympathy.
Yeah.
And she does this by essentially her defense is that everything that she said was true, that Marie Antoinette was guilty, that she had wanted the necklace, that she had written loads of letters, that she was in Versailles. So she gets sentenced to life imprisonment in the Salpêtrière.
Yeah,
which is it's a kind of former munitions factory, isn't it? That is notorious as the place where prostitutes get sent.
It's basically a prostitute's prison.
So she gets taken there, and she hasn't been told before the sentence is read to her what she's going to suffer. So she's taken to the prison. It's read out to her. She's told that she's going to be birched, branded, and be imprisoned for life. And she goes absolutely ballistic. She starts kind of scratching and
writhing around
and writhing. Yeah. She bites a chunk out of the executioner. She kind of swallows his flesh. So it is said, and she's pinned down. And the branding iron has V on it for voleuse, for thief. One of the brands is successfully imprinted, but the other one she's twisting so much that it burns her breast, and there's kind of stench of roasting meat. So very, very horrible. She's then taken inside. She's given a kind of pudding bowl, so all her hair is chopped off, and then she is put into a rough grey Hessian dress and locked up. And amazingly, in 1787, so only a couple of years later, she escapes. And immediately it's assumed that this is all part of conspiracy, that the Queen wants her out of the way. And there may be an element of the fact. I mean, I don't know. Maybe it's possible. Who knows? Anyway, she gets to London. And when she's there, she writes this venomously slanderous attack on the Queen. She claims to have had a sapphic relationship with Marie Antoinette. She describes midnight assignations with the Queen. Heavens, I found her so beautiful. I said to myself, it is the goddess Flora toying with a humble little flower. So the idea of Marie Antoinette as predatory, as domineering.
Has groomed her.
Her, yes, exactly. And Chantal Thomas says of her, she was the Justine of the pre-revolutionary epic. And Justine is the heroine of the Marquis de Sade's most famous novel. And the Justine is impeccably virtuous, and because she is virtuous, she is persecuted by the kind of Sardian monsters, the aristocrats, and essentially this is, if she is the Justine, then Marie Antoinette is a kind of Sardian monster.
Yeah, Simon Sharma says she represented herself as an orphan of an older France, a heroine from the sticks, an innocent gone astray. That's the same point, isn't it? That they're corrupting. She's an innocent, rather like the Nicole, the person who she is actually corrupted, ironically. But in this case, she has been corrupted personally by Marie Antoinette. And of course, that may seem completely bonkers, because we know, as you discussed so brilliantly in the last episode, Tom, that Marie Antoinette is actually she's not puritanical, but she's very bourgeois. In her,
no, I don't think she's bourgeois, but I think she's
her
a kind of
sexual morality is bourgeois.
She's a combination. She's Catholic, and she's Rousseauian.
Right.
She's a combination of kind of old school Catholic morality combined with a kind of girlish giddiness, a kind of love of the country.
Fair enough.
Flowers of.
But what she isn't is she is not a predatory. Lesbian sort of groomer of little girls or young women or whatever that this woman is claiming.
But the problem is that these are portrayals of her that have already gained traction, that she's a monster of extravagance and that she's a kind of predatory whore. And the reason this scandal is so devastating is both that it amplifies those stories, and that it makes them kind of very, very public. And so in the wake of it, you start to get that the portrayal of her as a kind of monstrous nymphomaniac is completely turbocharged. So by 1789, and we all know what happens in 1789, a pamphlet is published which describes her sexual record: nobility, clergy, third estate. So that this is the backdrop to the meeting of the three estates, which we'll be doing in due course. So it's obviously inspired by it. Any man has a right to her favours. The most handsome and robust are the most welcome. Guards, lackeys, actors, height of opprobrium. Oh, indelible shame.
Yeah.
So kind of loving it. And it's not just the queen who gets caught up on this, so also does her female favourite. So this is when the stories about the Duchesse de Polignac, who we talked about yesterday, one of her squad, they get vituperative as well. I mean, Duchesse de Polignac's relatively harmless, so is the Princesse de Lamballe, but they are both cast as kind of co-vampires in Marie Antoinette's nymphomaniac cover.
Queens of Vice, Tom.
Queens of Vice, absolutely. And what's fascinating is that in the wake of the punishment of de la Motte, you start to get fantasies in which Marie Antoinette and her favourites suffer similar punishments. So a lampoon is published against the Duchesse de Polignac, and it kind of says, let's see her humiliated. Let's see her punished. Let's see her suffer before the gaze of the people. Yes, madame, you must do penance. And as the choice is up to the confessor, here is the penance I impose in the name of the nation. Shave your head, don a grey Hessian dress as your only adornment, and go to the august assembly of the Estates General in this garb to make atonement and deliver up any remains of your plundering. So it's kind of working with, the punishments of convicted prostitutes.
And also the Austrianness is really important here, isn't it? Because there are two claims additional to this. One that's very common is that she actually, her first victim, as it were, or the first person who perhaps groomed her was her own brother, the Austrian Emperor Joseph II.
Yeah.
And of course,
so to pursue the Mozart thing, he's the too many notes king.
Yeah,
in Amadeus.
Yes, yeah. But then the other thing is, of course, that if she is Austrian, then she's not French, and she must therefore be a traitor. And the more that the international temperature kind of rises, especially once the revolution has got going, the more people say, she is not merely sexually kind of depraved, she's politically depraved, and she must be, in the course of her sapphic lusts, she is absorbing secrets and passing on secrets to France's enemies.
Yes, exactly so. And there's a sense that Maria Theresa, her mother, has sent her as a kind of to infect France with her villainy. So you may wonder, well, how on earth does Marie Antoinette cope with all this abuse? And the truth is that she treats it all with kind of amused disdain. So as early as 1775, she wrote to Maria Theresa, her mother, saying, we're in the middle of a satirical song epidemic. They have made some up about everyone at court, men and women alike. French licenses even extended to the king. I myself have not been spared. Although this country is fond enough of malice, the songs are so flat and in such bad taste that they are successful neither with the public nor high society.
So two things there. One, she's only 20 years old when she says that. So I always find the stuff about Marie Antoinette actually unbelievably repulsive. I mean, I just think
it's
how
awful.
Anybody can I mean, how you can take the side of the pamphleteers and not of the girl stroke young woman at the centre of them is beyond me. But the other interesting thing is that she is quite wrong about that. So when she says successful neither with the public nor high society, she is dead wrong. They are enormously successful, and a lot of people, if you say it often enough, people will believe it.
Yeah, and so Chantal Thomas in her wonderful book about the pamphlets and Marie Antoinette's relationship to them, I mean, she basically says that one of the reasons perhaps why they don't impinge on Marie Antoinette is that she simply doesn't understand the power of the written word. That
she doesn't read.
Yeah, she doesn't really read, and she says Marie Antoinette had nothing to learn from the outside world. The hot-headed, vehement words of the pamphlets were incomprehensible to her, and so failed to touch her. But there are expressions of public hostility that do have an impact. So in May 1785, and this is, when the scandal is kind of really building up, she goes into Paris and the people there refuse to cheer her. And 2 years later, she's being booed and hissed on the streets of Paris.
Tom, you say that, but actually Theo, our producer, would tell you that she's not. People aren't booing and hissing; they are shouting out "ooh ooh" and "gee gee gee." That's their equivalent of hissing.
Yeah, that's French for boo.
Yeah,
exactly. And so one of the chiefs of police in Paris writes to the king at Versailles and says that the Queen shouldn't go into the capital; it's unsafe for her. And so Louis XVI passes this on to his wife and forbids her to go to Paris. And, Marie Antoinette is deeply, deeply wounded by this. And so she cancels her public engagements in the capital and she basically retreats to the Petit Trianon, which, of course, then only makes the stories because, what's she up to in there with all her, her girlfriends? And terrible.
And the irony is, of course, she cannot win. That she's in a position now where whatever she does will be seen as evidence of guilt. So, ironically, the fact that she tried to be less formal than the court is seen that she's not a good queen. The fact that she's got her group of friends, she's a lesbian. The fact that she's not going into the city because she's being booed, that shows she's arrogant and she doesn't care about people. And a traitor. She cannot win. I feel really sorry for her.
And so you may wonder, well, does this matter? Does any of this matter? It's just surface froth. It does matter because it doesn't just damage the Queen. The whole scandal of the diamond necklace has also seriously, for the first time, damaged the public reputation of the King. Again, there have been kind of rumours bubbling under the surface, but again, it is this trial that brings slanders against the King to the surface. And there are two things that they focus. The first is that he is cast as a despot. He is the man who has sent all these people to the Bastille. He's a monster. He's an autocrat who doesn't respect the liberty of the people.
And as we'll see next time, that has enormous traction because of the political and financial crisis that France finds itself
absolutely. In. And the tragedy is that in a way, the King has kind of absorbed some of the lessons. So his treatment of Beaumarchais, who has written a preface to one of his plays that the King interprets as being an attack on him. He orders Beaumarchais to be arrested, but this time he doesn't send him to the Bastille. He sends him to a prison called the Saint-Lazare, which is a correction centre for delinquent boys. Where they're taught the error of their ways and kind of given the birch and things like that. And everyone finds this hilarious. And so Beaumarchais, who'd always had laughter on his side, now finds that the laughter is against him. And basically his reputation is destroyed by it. So it suggests the King is kind of learning how to play the game.
The King, by the way, it's not a despot. I mean, that's one thing that's really worth stressing. If you think Louis XVI is a despotic monarch, I mean, there are many things that Louis XVI gets wrong, but being too bloodthirsty, too repressive is definitely, I don't think there's any historian who would think that was one of them.
Right, and if he'd wanted if he'd been a real despot, the Cardinal de Rohan would have vanished and wouldn't have been sitting in his chambers having kind of capons. But the other thing that this plays into is the idea of the King as sexually inadequate, and more specifically now a cuckold, because if Marie Antoinette is cast as being this kind of voracious nymphomaniac, there is this sense that her powers are being drawn from the sexual inadequacies of the King, and so you get all these rhymes about the size and the
rigidity or otherwise,
the flaccidity of the royal member. And in the kind of the account of the Queen and the affair that de la Motte writes in London, she says that the Cardinal and the Queen had been having an affair, and that they had been engaged in a conspiracy to make the Cardinal the Prime Minister of France and to subject France to the dominance of Austria. And so the King is somehow seen as being complicit in this. And so the King and Queen of France, the emblems of the greatness of the country, are being cast as agents of an enemy power.
Well, Robert Darnton, in his book The Revolutionary Temper, quotes a bookseller at the height of the diamond necklace affair, who wrote, I think, in his journal or to his brother, I can't remember which, but he wrote, "The public spirit has turned against him, the King, because he inspires no respect, no fear, no confidence, and he throws away the public's money for all sorts of follies. And that, that is the lesson, that if you are a slightly gullible reader of these pamphlets and this sort of these propagandistic kind of pornographic fantasies, that's what you think about the king. That, as Darnton says, he's well-meaning but stupid, bewildered, incompetent, timid, indecisive, constantly drunk, unfit even to govern a German principality.
Yeah, absolutely. And Darnton is brilliant on why this matters, because essentially it's also going with the grain of the crisis that France itself is confronting. That this is a time where the state is running out of money and where people are starting to go hungry. There've been a succession of terrible harvests, and all this kind of stuff about diamond necklaces and cuckolding and cardinals and all kinds of stuff. It does actually matter because it gives colour and venom to what otherwise might be kind of the sense of inchoate forces that are going wrong.
Yeah, absolutely it does.
And so I think important just to emphasise at this point, as we approach the fateful year 1789, that this is not about republicanism. Again, so much of this is coming from within the court. So it's coming from the Duc de Provence, the king's young brother. It's also coming from the Duke of Orleans, the Duc d'Orléans, who is the kind of he after the three royal brothers, the most significant peer of the realm, who has a whole area of Paris that is his private, fiefdom.
Yeah, the Palais Royal.
And he's the Palais Royal. And so he's basically said anyone can publish what they like there. And so it's become a hotbed of all these kind of pamphlets and stuff. So there's that. So it absolutely doesn't imply republicanism. It's the signs of an immunity system going down. And it matters because basically the whole body politic seems diseased. And Dominic, I think in the next two episodes, we're going to explore exactly, beyond the flower gardens of Versailles, exactly how these diseases are kind of manifesting themselves out in Paris and in the countryside.
So we'll be back on Thursday, and we will be looking at the crisis that France finds itself in the 1780s, the crisis that leads to the calling of the States General and the beginning of the revolution. So there'll be a bit of finance, there'll be a lot of politics, there'll be a lot of famine, there'll be all of this kind of stuff.
Tennis courts.
There'll be tennis courts, of course. We'll get into the tennis court oath, and then, of course, to the fall of the Bastille. Very, very exciting. À bientôt, à jeudi, et au revoir.
Au revoir.
The French Revolution is the central political event in modern history. There are other things that compete. The Russian Revolution, most obviously.
Or the American Revolution, but I agree, neither of those really compare.
No. To me, the French Revolution is the paradigmatic example of people trying to reboot a society, to make it again, to make something new. So it's that on the one hand. And then, of course, there are other dimensions to it. It becomes the great crucible of conservatism. It's in response to the French Revolution that Edmund Burke writes the most famous example of kind of literary conservatism in history. His reflections on the revolution in France. It's the French Revolution that exports the idea of the nation and of modern nationalism across Europe and arguably the world. And its iconography, Tom, we're still so familiar with it. I mean, obviously it gave France its national anthem. It gave it its flag, the tricolor flag. But the ideas of the idea of left and right comes from the French Revolution, from where people sat.
In the National Assembly, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And when you think about all the great writing that's been done on it, even just in English, Dickens is A Tale of Two Cities, one of the most influential books on our perception of history that has ever been written. We mentioned Burke.
Dickens influenced by Carlyle and his great History of the Revolution.
And of all the history books that have been written in our lifetimes, one of the most influential on the way people write history, I think, is Simon Schama's book, Citizens. Some listeners may not agree with Schama's take on the revolution. His take is actually not dissimilar from Margaret Thatcher's, because he very much emphasizes the violence and the costs of the revolution. But the way he did it, the emphasis on narrative, and his ability to take unexpected aspects and to take by roads and to make them so richly fascinating and colourful.
That's his great genius as a writer, isn't it?
Yeah, but that had an enormous impact on other historians.
I mean, it's a reflection of the inherent drama and the scale and the sweep of the French Revolution that it has inspired such great writers. So there's Hilary Mantel as well. Her first great historical novel was about the French Revolution.
Actually, it's, for me, her best book. Well, one of her, certainly her best historical book. No, I think it's... And what makes it so interesting is not just the high drama, but obviously the questions. Why did it all happen? And even more than that.
Well, Dominic, we've answered that. It's because of the diamond necklace scandal.
Right, so we can stop right now.
Yeah, we've solved it.
So to be very, very simplistic for a second, if people are only going to listen to 6 minutes of this podcast and they want to know why the French Revolution happened, I think there are 3 ingredients. One is there is a financial and a high political crisis. Effectively, France is running out of money. Number 2, a social crisis. So there's horrendous weather, freak weather. There's famine. There is kind of mass hunger in France.
So contingency, then.
So contingency.
Playing a very important role.
And then the third thing, which is much more deterministic, is a kind of cultural moment. And I know you'll be talking about this in a subsequent episode. An obsession with progress, with purity, and above all with virtue, and an idea that you can turn the world off and back on again and start again with a clean
reboot
slate.
it.
Forget about the record of history. And I think it is the combination of those 3 things that makes it different from the 2 obvious antecedents, which are Mrs. Thatcher mentioned the Glorious Revolution in Britain in 1688-89, and then of course the revolution in the American colonies.
Although that is important, I think.
It is important, but this is different. It's qualitatively
Absolutely.
different.
Yes.
So the question is, why did those 3 things, how and why did they come together? And for many years, historians looked for big, overarching ideological explanations. But then, really, especially from the 1980s onwards, and thanks partly to people like Sharma or Robert Darnton, another brilliant historian, American historian, who's written about this period, historians started to use the French Revolution as the subject to reinvigorate the idea of narrative, to say actually events really matter, and the chronology, the series, the chain is enormously important. But you ended last time, you did that brilliant episode about the diamond necklace scandal, and your point that all the discussion about Marie Antoinette and the sort of the semi-pornographic, or I mean,
very
literally pornographic pamphlets and the abuse of her, that it reflected an idea that if as it were the body of the queen or of the king were diseased, that reflected a disease in the body politic. And that's how we ended. But we didn't say why the body politic was diseased. So what is wrong with France? I guess that is the question. And to start with, let's kick off with the man that you introduced us to, Louis XVI. So you described him as, I think very reasonably, a kind of reasonably likable but ultimately slightly inconsequential man, mild, affable. He loves his locks, going hunting, but not a man it is easy to hate. So you look at Louis XVI and you don't see a man who millions of people would want to see dragged.
He's not
to
a
the
monster.
guillotine. No, he's not a monster at all. He became king when he was 19 years old in 1774, and actually that's, you might say, a young man. But actually, that's quite old for a French king.
Yeah, because usually they're toddlers, aren't they?
His grandfather, Louis XV, had been 5. His predecessor, Louis XIV, had been 4 when he became king. So actually, Louis is not badly placed, and he's been prepared for it. His kingdom, as we discussed before, the biggest kingdom in continental Europe, 28 million people, the world's second largest economic power, really, after Britain. The only European country that has both a serious navy and a serious army. Britain, for example, only really has a navy. Paris, very different from today's Paris. So it's the second biggest city in Europe after London, but it's a city, it's not the kind of grand city of avenues and boulevards.
Yeah, because they will come in later in the 19th century.
Of slums, but also, it's literally the urban poor and prostitutes and criminals, but also a city of coffee houses and books and ideas and newspapers and theatres and all these kinds of things. And then beyond it, you have the other big cities of France also doing very well. So France is unusual in having so many kind of provincial centres, prosperous provincial centres, places like Bordeaux and Lyon and stuff. And then beyond that, 8 out of 10 French people work on the land. In La France profonde, they are peasants, by and large. So France is much, much more agricultural than Britain is.
It is, and also much more kind of regionally distinct, really.
Yes.
Places like Brittany are very distinctive, and you saw that when we were talking about the Cardinal de Rohan, that he has a sense of his distinctiveness because he is Breton.
Yeah, absolutely. So the funny thing about Louis XVI, Louis XVI would not have been able to understand most of his subjects because they wouldn't have spoken what he would recognize as French. They would have spoken dialects of French, or they'd have spoken Flemish or Occitan or Breton or German, all of these kinds of things. So Louis has been brought up to be king, and we think of him as an absolute monarch. And he had copied out as a teenager a text to tell him that French kings had received from God himself the greatest and most absolute power over other men that has ever been entrusted to one man. But that absolute power is very tightly circumscribed. So first of all, he relies on lots of other people. He relies on judges and nobles and officials. He's got his intendants, they're called the royal officials that they send out to the kingdom. If he loses their support, that's very bad for him. He needs them.
Because he does have a famous exchange, doesn't he? Is it 1787, where he basically someone in the Parliament was saying this is illegal, and Louis famously says it's legal because I say it is. But that's a mark of weakness, isn't it, rather than of strength, that he has to say that.
Right, because France does have other institutions and constitutional conventions, and they are so complicated that nobody really understands them. So his grandfather, Louis XV, in the 1750s, had said, France is such a kind of multi-layered, complicated machine. I'd like to get all this written down on paper so I can make sense of it. And he'd commissioned constitutional scholars to make a compilation of documents. And they came back to him eventually and they just said, we're going to give up. It's not possible. It's much too complicated. Because it's a bit like Britain. It is a massive patchwork of conventions and customs and laws.
But Dominic, you said you compared it to a machine. And we talked about how Louis XVI is a great one for tinkering in a workshop. Do you think that this is a frustration to him? That he, as someone who obviously likes contraptions and working out how things function, that the state kind of defies his ability to do that?
I think absolutely. Because I think Louis, like other people of his generation, is a product of the mid-18th century. He comes from a different world from Louis XIV. He's an Enlightenment man to some degree. And that doesn't mean he's sitting there reading Voltaire, but it means he's in that, he's in that context.
Things can be solved. Things can be sorted.
He's also been brought up, by the way, to respect what he sees as the rights of his citizens. I know you're going to be talking a lot about rights in a subsequent episode. And Louis had written down in his kind of exercise book as a boy that the rights of his citizens were life, honor, liberty, and property. Not so dissimilar from the language of the American tax dodgers, Tom. So his regime, the ancien regime, as people say, the old regime, in your sort of Charles Dickens' Tale of Two Cities version of the French Revolution, it's corrupt and cruel, isn't it? There's marquises kind of
running over paupers in their carriages.
Exactly, all of that stuff. And very antiquated and reactionary. In reality, that regime is very, very modern and is changing all the time. Nobody says we are living in the ancien regime. We're living in the old regime. They think they are living in an age of enormous change and modernity. And we mentioned already Simon Schama. In his book Citizens, he's brilliant at bringing all this out. And he says, wherever you look as a historian, there are signs of great excitement and dynamism and energy. So he mentions, French trade, French industry. It's the home of chemistry, of maths.
Lavoisier, who will end up losing his head, won't he?
Both Schama and Robert Darnton, in their books about this, emphasize hot air balloons. Ballooning is a great spectacle and a great, French ballooning is the AI of the day. It's something that people are talking about. They don't know what world it will bring. It's tremendously exciting. The first flight was from the Bois de Boulogne in 1783. And people would say, Robert Darnton quotes some periodicals, we live in the century of inventions. We're surrounded by miracles. Genius is everywhere, conquering nature and the elements.
And that's very Enlightenment, isn't it?
It's totally Enlightenment.
So Benjamin Franklin is a great hero in Paris, and he's a great one for these kind of experiments with lightning.
Absolutely, yeah, because of course the whole American Republic is an experiment, isn't it? So America comes to be identified both with nature and the kind of beauties and simplicity of nature, but also with this idea of kind of progress, of modernity.
To what extent is the existence of the American Republic a kind of standing encouragement to people in France to think, yeah, we could rebuild in that way?
It's a good question. I think people are fascinated by the American experiment. They're curious to see how it works out. People like Benjamin Franklin are very popular in France. But that said, if America didn't exist, the French Revolution would still have happened.
Yeah. Sure.
So I don't think it's a direct inspiration, but I think some of the language, definitely, there's a commonality of language between the French and American Revolution.
And just going on from that, the Crown's support for the American Revolution obviously will play a key part in its ultimate bankruptcy.
Yeah.
But is there also a sense that the fact that a monarch is going to the assistance of rebels against another monarch, an example of someone sitting on a tree, sitting on a branch and soaring off the branch?
Yeah, I think it probably is. I mean, there are people in the French regime who are very nervous about the idea of doing this. So
for that reason?
Well, they're more worried about the finances.
But I just wondered whether there was a kind of, an ideological anxiety about it as well. Because Louis XVI seems not particularly to have been worried about that.
I don't think they're thinking about the American Republic so closely as that, to be honest with you.
Okay.
I think they're more interested in giving Britain a bloody nose. Anyway, so all this excitement about change means you have two things. We have a tremendous sense of possibility on the one hand. We can do anything. We can conquer nature, so what can't we do? And on the other hand, of course, there are always people who lose out from change. So in this, just to give you a small example, if you're a weaver or an artisan or something, there are new businesses, new industrialized businesses coming up that may put you out of work. And so you would like to blame somebody. And we'll come to that later on. As part of that modernity, I think you also get a new political culture, especially in Paris. This is not created by the French Revolution. It creates the revolution.
Right, because we were talking about that in the context of the kind of pornographic abuse of Marie Antoinette.
Exactly. Robert Darnton's book, The Revolutionary Temper, is absolutely wonderful on all this. On the coffee houses, on people swapping ideas, people would read pamphlets out on street corners. There's a new term which we're very familiar with, created in 1750 to describe this, opinion publique, public opinion. That phrase was not used before because it didn't really exist in the same way. So there's that, but also I think there is also a really important thing, which is a new language that people use to discuss politics. So we were saying that Louis, you talked about him and the locks, the idea of tinkering and the world being a machine and improving it. And that's very much a product of the age of reason. But actually, when he becomes king and he's 19 years old, there is a generation emerging, the kind of generation below him, who are much more romantic. They are the people who are loving Rousseau, Jean-Jacques Rousseau.
Well, but not entirely, because Marie Antoinette, who is his generation, I mean, she's part of that. I mean, she is the great embodiment of that in a way.
It's definitely younger people who embrace that, but of course it percolates out. So Marie Antoinette is absolutely a classic example of somebody who absorbs this cult of sensibility. Nature, simplicity, all of these things, intense feeling, tenderness, friendship, family.
And also the idea that if you obey the impulses of your emotions, that will lead you to truth.
Yeah.
So it's kind of bizarre, isn't it? That simultaneously it's an age of reason, but it's also an age of intense feeling. And the assumption seems to be that the two, well, there is a tension there, but there seems to be an assumption that there isn't.
Well, I think there was a slight generational issue. So I think if you were born in 1740, let's say, you grow up in an age that is polite, witty, ironic, skeptical. Voltaire. Voltaire is very skeptical. Yeah. They love poking fun. There's always a kind of wry smile at the corner of your mouth. That kind of attitude. They're basically quite British. And I think if you are a generation later, let's say you're born in 1760, then that skepticism and stuff, you find that a bit desiccated, maybe. It leaves you cold. What you're all about is your heart, is your living your truth, Tom.
Living your truth, yes, absolutely.
Tears, crying is really important to these people and is important in the revolution. Tears are seen as a sign of authenticity and honesty. So people are always breaking down in tears in the revolutionary story. And the idea that underpins all of this is the idea of virtue. And I was thinking when I was writing the notes, how virtue in the French Revolution is the diversity of its day. In other words, it is an abstract noun that if you have any decency as a person at all, you're in favour of it. And if you start to poke fun at it, or to say, well, I just think it's all overblown, it's the Emperor's new clothes, I don't really agree with it. People say, you're not just old, you're evil.
You say virtue. I mean, you might more properly say virtus, which is the Latin word from which the French word comes, and actually has the sense of manliness as well. And I think one of the dimensions of the French Revolution, which we will be exploring over the course of this series and the subsequent series on it, is the way in which actually the kind of the egalite bros are quite sexist.
Yeah, of course.
It is a very, very chauvinist movement, I think, the French Revolution.
I think that's right. So the man who embodies all this more than anybody else, by the way, I think is Maximilien Robespierre. And we'll come to him later on. He absolutely drinks deeply of all this stuff. So it's a very politicized world and very passionate, but it is also, I think it's worth emphasizing, even before the revolution, a violent world. In Citizen, Simon Schama famously wrote that violence was not just a byproduct of politics, but violence was the revolution itself. And I think he's right, but I think it's also worth emphasizing that France was already quite violent. So any history of 18th century France is punctuated by riots, lynchings, looting, people being publicly beheaded, prisoners being broken on the wheel, troops firing into crowds. So in other words, when the revolution starts, and it doesn't start with one thing, it starts with a succession of things, a lot of these things have already happened before. They're not novelties. The revolution is not a storm breaking from an otherwise placid, beautiful blue sky. It's a one storm cloud among many, Tom.
Yeah.
We talked about tax and finance. So money is at the absolute center of it. And we should get into some of the money.
Follow the money.
Follow the money. Exactly. We should follow the money. So all early modern monarchies suffered massive money problems. I mean, it's the story of the English Civil War. It's the story of the American Revolution. Monarchies trying to raise more funds. And the reason they're doing that is because they're living in a new age with antiquated systems. There's been a military revolution, so they are funding bigger navies and bigger armies than ever before. But also they're doing it on a global scale, which they weren't doing 200 years earlier. You know, Britain, France, they have to maintain fleets all over the planet.
And for France, the fact that Britain has emerged as a rival power and in a larger economy, I mean, is really it's unsettling because France has not had to face that before. France has always been the largest power, economically speaking. And so that imposes massive strains, doesn't it? And you were talking about the Navy. The Royal Navy is the key to British power. And so the French have to have a Navy. But as you say, I mean, it's unbelievable strain.
It is. So France has been running up massive debts since the 1720s, and it doesn't have a national bank. Britain has a national bank, but France, for various reasons, doesn't. So,
and France had a kind of traumatic experience with a slightly dodgy Scottish financier,
John Law.
It's a kind of tulip mania bust.
There'd been a massive stock market bust, and that basically turned them off finance. So they distrust the idea of a national bank.
You know, that is when the word millionaire is coined.
Is that so?
Yeah, because so many people become so rich and then they lose it all.
Tom, when Theo gives us an absolute roasting for going over time,
sorry, yes,
it will definitely not be my fault.
Sorry.
So, even before the American War, France has already got very, very big debts. It's got 2 billion livres in debt, and it's basically spending 60% of its budget servicing that debt, so on interest payments. And this is growing all the time. The interesting thing is that Britain's debt is much greater. Its debt is 3 times greater, but Britain can always raise new taxes through the House of Commons. The government needs no more money, the House of Commons votes for it, bang, job done. France can't do that. Not only does it not have a national bank, it doesn't have a regular elected assembly. People do remember that there was once a thing called the Estates General. It was last met in 1614, 1615, and nobody can really remember what it was, how it was organised, who voted for it, or anything like that.
Is the existence of the British Parliament that is able to raise money, is this something that in the build-up to the French Revolution, people are looking at enviously and saying, why don't we have a system like this?
Yes. A lot of the revolutionaries at the beginning basically want to turn France into Britain. They want a more liberal economy, and they want a representative institution or vote tax increases, and they think, bang, that'll magically fix all our problems.
And so that's the Estates General. That's the only kind of precedent in French history they have.
So France is raising tax through like a lot of very strange, antiquated things. They've got a property tax that a lot of towns don't pay. They've got a very lucrative tax on salt. But again, that just increases. That means there's loads of smuggling. And they have internal customs duties. You are a miller in, Provence or something. You want to sell your grain in Paris. You have to pay multiple duties to get your grain from A to B. And that obviously is very bad for the internal economy if people are having to pay tax basically when they step outside their own town to sell things.
And the kind of thing that a workman in his workshop, like Louis XVI, would want to fix.
Would want to fix. Exactly. So here's the thing. Why don't they fix it? Louis, when he comes in at the age of 19, he's tempted by the idea of fixing it. But the issue is that whenever he comes up against opposition, he almost always backs down. So right at the beginning of his reign, he had a bloke called Turgot, who was a liberal reformer. He was basically slightly Liz Truss. He wanted to go for growth, deregulate the economy, all of this kind of stuff. He liberalized bread prices. Of course, that meant the bread prices went up. There was lots of looting, and Louis eventually basically got rid of him, said, you're pushing too far, too fast.
So, Dominic, your case might be that the problem with Louis isn't that he is too despotic, but that he's not despotic enough.
If he'd been a charismatic and sufficiently adept statesman, that he could take a bit of unpopularity and he could persuade the people he needed, and he could show concrete results, and he'd stuck to his guns, he might have been a much, much more effective king of France. But as it is, what he will do is he will always gesture in the direction of change and then back down when he gets into trouble. So, as Sharma says, and I quote, he wanted to be loved. And that is not an ideal thing for a king in a time of tremendous change and challenge. So in the next few years, the problem actually gets a lot worse. And it gets worse, as you said, because they join the American War. So Turgot's eventual successor, a guy called a Swiss banker called Necker, Jean-Jacques Necker.
Great name.
He says, go for that American war. Let's help the rebels in the American colonies. And he organizes lots of more short-term loans to pay for it. Now, it's mainly a naval war, but as we know from the rest of its history, nothing is more expensive than an 18th century top-notch navy. So they run up huge debts, 1.5 billion livres, on top of their existing debts, 90% of which comes from loans. This will be a brilliant gamble, by the way, if you get the Caribbean.
Because the Caribbean is so rich.
Yeah. If you get that, that's why they really have joined the war. They want to get the Jamaica, places like that.
But that requires them to inflict a defeat on Britain more total than the ultimate defeat is.
So although the British lose those 13 North American colonies, they keep lots of the rest of North America. They don't lose any of the Caribbean, which was their main priority. And so actually the French have basically run up huge debts and they've got nothing to show for it. And Simon Sharma says, without much exaggeration, it can be said that it was the costs of the war that brought on the terminal crisis of the French monarchy. So,
should we get to the terminal crisis?
Yes. So let's fast forward 3 years to the year of the diamond necklace trial. So now we're in 1786. The finance minister now is a guy called Charles Alexandre de Calonne. He's very rich. He's very urbane. He's very sort of witty. He's a stock market player, and therefore everybody hates him. For understandable reasons.
Bankers.
And in August 1786, Calonne goes to see Louis XVI, and he says, I've got a bit of a bombshell for you. We are looking into the financial abyss. He says, our annual deficit every year is 80 million livres, and half of all our revenue is now being spent on paying the interest on our existing loans. And he says, what is worse? Necker's short-term loans that he took out to pay for the war in America are about to fall due. and we don't have any money to pay them back. And he says to Louis, we have to totally reform the constitution. We just have to sort out this problem with the tax system once and for all and get new taxes, because we can't rely on new loans to pay the old loans. So you may say, well, what is this problem? Why don't they just bring in new taxes? And the reason is, France is a society based on the idea of hierarchy and privileges. So if you are a nobleman or a clergyman, you don't pay tax. And people don't think of that as a disgraceful exemption. They think that's the essence of our liberties. These are our God-given and our ancestral rights as Frenchmen.
And it's a source of aspiration, isn't it, for people? Because it is possible to enter the clergy or to become to gain patents of nobility. So it's a kind of incentive to stick with the system.
It is. And also people don't like the idea of a uniform system like a machine. They say that is what will destroy liberty. Liberty lies in difference and in quirks and in eccentricities and traditions. And a government that tries to erase that and just to put the stamp of royal authority and say everybody must pay is a despotic government. And we don't want that. We want people to stand up for our traditions. And the people they want in particular are these institutions called the Parlement. Now, confusingly, they're not parliaments.
Right. So these are the ones that the Parlement of Paris that the Cardinal de Rohan opted to be tried by rather than the king in the previous
They're courts.
episode.
They're high courts, basically. Yeah. And around them, so the Parlement in Paris, around them, it employs hundreds of people, clerks and stuff. It's got its own kind of quarter of the city. There's a whole kind of community of lawyers and notaries around it. And people invest it with tremendous, it's culturally very meaningful. People invest it with a lot of significance. The parlements, these high courts, when the king introduces an edict, they have to register it. And they have to say, yep, fine, it doesn't contravene the rights of French people that you as a king have sworn to uphold. And what's happened, there's a pattern that basically since the 1750s, Louis XV and then Louis XVI have asked the Parlement to approve to register new taxes, and the Parlement has bitterly resisted. And they have said increasingly, the reason we're resisting the new taxes is because we're defending liberty against your despotism. We're defending the nation against your court in Versailles. We're defending the ancient French constitution against your suffocating, joyless absolutism.
And does the physical separation of the king in Versailles from the Parlement, say in Paris, that presumably is enhancing that sense of separation between the monarchy and the sense the Parlement have of that they are defending the people's rights?
I think so, Tom. I think absolutely. I think it's a real problem actually for Louis XVI. Geography. The fact that Versailles is 12 miles from Paris. He never leaves Versailles, or barely ever leaves Versailles. That 12 miles, most ordinary people can't afford to take an expensive coach to Versailles. So he's always slightly sealed off. He's always in a bit of a bubble, and there's a real resentment of that bubble. It creates the idea of a corrupt, out of touch court. And there's, you get the sense that Paris is this kind of place seething with political excitement and theatre and new ideas and newspapers. And Versailles is this sort of airless world of snobbery and ritual. And I think it's a really good point. I agree with you. I think it's a huge problem for Louis. So anyway, Calonne says to Louis, look, we've got this huge problem. The Parlement are never going to give us what we want. We have to bypass the Parlement. We have to go over their heads. I'm going to call an assembly of the greatest men in the kingdom, the notables. If they agree with the idea of the new taxes, then maybe we can basically just ignore the Parlement and do what we like.
And this idea of an assembly of notables, this is, again, something with ancient precedent that, is being taken out of the lumber box of antiquated traditions.
Exactly. Yeah, it is. Exactly. And Louis says to Calonne, I'm not sure about this. I mean, this is a very big step. It's like try to bypass the institutions to get this money. And Calonne says, trust me, if you do this, you will go down in history as the man whose courage and foresight solved the financial problems of the French monarchy forever. And the historian Jeremy Popkin has a very strong line after this in his book. He says, and so Louis XVI allowed Calonne to set in motion the series of events that would lead to the complete overthrow of his monarchy.
This assembly of the notables has gathered. With what consequence?
So basically, Calonne has brought together all the bigwigs in the kingdom, princes, archbishops, judges, dukes, all of these people. And he says to them, right, okay, here's my plan. We're going to abolish all these mad tax privileges. We're just going to have one tax on landed property, and irrespective of your social status, you'll have to pay.
So he is asking turkeys to vote for Christmas, basically.
He is, but he's saying, look, this is in the interest of France. Come on, we've got to do this. We don't want to keep losing to the British.
Sure.
Number two, he says, we're going to lift some of these mad, antiquated regulations. Let's have the same, you pay the same duty wherever you are in France. Let's have freer markets so people can sell across France. Let's, all of these vested interests, we can relax some of these rules. So we'll have more competition, we'll have more growth. And number three, he says, I know I'm asking you a lot, so we're going to have elected local assemblies, regular elected local assemblies, and basically you, the landowners, the bigwigs, will dominate them. So, you'll get your way. Your privileges will remain intact. It's a very, very enlightened scheme. It's a very mid-18th century scheme. It's rational, it's sensible, it's kind of, let's have a bit of uniformity and sort this thing out.
So it's not going to work, in other words.
Yeah, and the notables just hate it.
Yeah,
they hate it because they don't like obviously paying the land tax. They don't like his plan for the assemblies because he says, well, obviously you'd sit with the commons in your province together in one assembly. They don't like that at all. They say the commons, which they call the third estate, they have to be separate. We're not sitting with those
riffraff.
Great unwashed. Yeah, riffraff. And they say it's always the game that these different institutions play. To basically kick the tax increases down the road, they say, you'd have to call the Estates General. I mean, no one really knows what that is, but they sort of, because they think it'll never happen, I suspect. They say, call the Estates General to approve
it's like
the taxes.
The Aztecs bringing out the owl.
Right.
It's the ultimate recourse.
You need more representation. Basically, we don't want to carry the can for the tax increases. You have to get a bigger body to do it. Calonne is really furious about this, and now he does something that is actually disastrous from the perspective of the French monarchy. He goes public. He seeks to rouse the people. He sends a pamphlet out to every priest in the city in Paris, and he says, you have to read this to your congregation, your Sunday sermons. He has it reprinted in gazettes. He has it read out on street corners and read aloud to the crowds in Les Halles, in the big markets. And this thing, he tells people, France is at a crossroads. Finances are in a total mess. Either we have total change or total collapse. And in this pamphlet, he uses a lot of the language that anticipates the revolution. So he's using terms like the national will, patriotism. He says, the privileged will be sacrificed. Yes, when justice requires it and need demands it. Would it be better to tax again the unprivileged, the people? And that kind of language, people haven't heard that from French royal finance ministers before. He's anticipating a lot of the terms that will be used in the revolution. Now, when he comes out with all this, the notables go absolutely ballistic. How dare you rouse the people against us?
And so they complain to Louis about him.
So they complain to Louis, and Louis, as is always the way, Louis sacks him. Sorry, mate, you've got to go.
People don't like the notables don't like it.
The notables don't like it. As Sharma says in Citizens, by taking his case to the public, Calonne had made politics a matter of national attention. Once Pandora's box had been opened in this way, it proved impossible to close the lid. After Calonne, anything was possible.
We love a Pandora's box.
I like the fact that Sharma's gone for Pandora's box.
So the Pandora's box has been opened and the storm clouds of revolution are gathering.
Definitely they are. Now, the trouble is that the debate has started. A public debate. People are talking about this in cafes, on street corners and things. And as amazing as it may sound to many listeners, most people take the notable side. the side of the very privileged people who don't want to pay more taxes. So Robert Darnton quotes journalists of the day. Our notables, which were thought to be puppets or courtiers, are for the most part well-informed patriots who know the true interests of the nation. Because the one thing that people are really worried about is not the fact that nobles don't pay taxes. It is they have a dread of an overweening autocratic monarchy. So the nobles are very good at posing as the defenders of the French people's liberties, and people believe it. People are roused by it.
But they're kind of riding a crocodile, right?
They are. Oh, totally. Yeah, the notables are in for a shock. So now Louis has to find a new finance minister, and he says, "Well, what I'll do is I'll get one of the notables to do it." I mean, that's quite a canny idea. He gets a guy who's the Archbishop of Toulouse, who'd been a very outspoken notable, who's called Etienne Charles de Lomenie de Brienne.
He's one of those kind of classic late 18th century French bishops who don't really believe in God or...
Yeah, exactly. But that's the thing, nonsense. Right? There was talk of making him Archbishop of Paris, and Louis had apparently said, surely, as Archbishop, he should believe in God, shouldn't he? Isn't that And Brienne also, entertainingly, there's a lot of skin disease in this
There really is, isn't there?
So Brienne, I read, he suffered from a skin disease that left his face, quote, a mass of peeling scabs and tissue, and yet he was thought of as a personable and congenial man. So that says a lot for his personality.
It does. Well, so we've had Louis XV, who died with his face covered in pustules, and we're going to be meeting Marat, aren't we? Who,
Mirabeau. The ugliest man in France.
Mirabeau, yes, his face. Well, yes. So lots of big figures with unpleasant skin complaints.
Yeah. So Brienne had been an opposition figure, and he had said, like a lot of the notables, I think Calonne's stuff about the deficit is balderdash. I don't think there really is a deficit, actually.
Let's have a look in the books and just check.
When I look in the books,
God.
There'll be loads of money. And he looks at the books. He says, well, Calonne, it's true. Calonne wasn't telling the truth about the deficit because he wasn't. It's not 80 million. It's 140 million.
Oh, God.
And so actually Brienne then has to go back with his skin complaint to his old chap chums in the notables. And he says, actually...
guys.
Actually, we do need new taxes, and he wants a land tax and a stamp tax. What could possibly go wrong with a stamp tax, Tom? There's always very successful wheeze. And the notables say yet again, no, we don't either. So you will have to call the Estates General if you want new taxes, whatever it is. You have to call it. So they scrap the Assembly of the Notables. So we're in 1787. And Louis is very, very depressed by all this. So there are accounts of him saying, he's basically spent all his time now going hunting and drinking and eating because he realizes...
Well, I mean, it's amazing that he can go hunting because he's, by this point, got incredibly obese. So you pity the horse that has to carry him. He's getting very fat.
He is very fat, but it's a sad fat, Tom, not a jolly fat.
Oh, definitely. He's not a jolly man.
No.
He's a sad fat man.
He's a sad fat man because he's... I think he can see that this is going to be really difficult.
Well, because what options does he have? Terrible. Every option is bad.
So Brienne and Louis get together and what are we going to do? They have two options. One is they could just do what everyone says and call this Estates General. But the issue with that is, once you open that box, one of Simon Schama's boxes, where's it going to lead? Like, will they have to have a constitution? Will they demand more power? Will you basically be reduced to being a British constitutional monarch? And Louis doesn't really want that for obvious reasons. I mean, why would you? You'd want to keep as much power as possible. The other thing they could do is they could go back to the old traditional thing of going through these courts, these parlements, and somehow persuade or bully them into approving the new taxes. And Brienne says, look, I'll do that. So he goes to the Paris Parlement, summer of 1787. How about a stamp and tax? How about a land tax, lads? And the Parlement of Paris say, no way. And they reject them in groundbreaking language. They say, the days when kings just ask for taxes are gone. Like, absolutism is over and the king must be governed by the law. The nation must give its consent to new taxes with regular meetings of the Estates General. And for the first time, they use a word to describe their fellow Frenchmen that had not been used before by such institutions. They don't call them subjects of the king. They call them citoyens, citizens.
But the thing that's amazing about this is that it's in defense of nobles and clergy not paying tax.
Yeah, it is.
All this kind of language that will be used in the revolution that consumes both the church and the nobility is first being used to defend the privileges of the church and the nobility.
It is. It's bonkers, isn't it? And I think there's two things there. One is that there's a degree of self-interest, obviously. But there are also the idea that all the nobility are like this sort of Dickensian vicomtes who are like whipping their peasants and forcing themselves on sort of poor women and stuff. A lot of these people are actually quite liberal. They have absorbed the language of the Americans, of the American colonists, and they genuinely believe in the Estates General and represents. They actually do like the idea of a British constitutional monarchy.
And we talked about one of them in the previous episode, Philippe, the Duke of Orleans, whose Palais Royal in the centre of Paris is the great centre of free speech, of the pamphlets, and will be the centre for the Jacobins.
Yeah, exactly. So there are people who genuinely, it's partly self-interest, but there are people who, I mean, let's not pretend that there aren't people who genuinely believe this and really do think that this is a great way, that making a huge fuss about these taxes is a great way to get what they want in the long run, which is basically the British system, the system that had been advocated by the great Enlightenment writer Montesquieu. Let's have that in France, separation of powers, a proper legislature, all of that, prime ministers, all of that kind of stuff. Anyway, Brienne is outraged that the Parlement has rejected his plan. And he now does a couple of very, very drastic things. First of all, the Parlement is exiled to Troyes in August. And literally it is sealed off by the Swiss Guard, by an elite unit of the French army. And they're all basically kicked out. And the reaction to that in Paris is total bedlam. So if you had a time machine, you went to Paris in 1787 and you got out, you would think that your coordinates, you're wrong.
Settings wrong.
You got the settings wrong. Because you'd think, whoa, this is the French Revolution. Because there is rioting up by the clerks. People who are giving out royal edicts are attacked by the crowd and two of them are almost beaten to death. A suspected police agent is beaten to death by the crowd. And the government eventually has to send in infantry units to secure the streets of the capital, and they end up shutting down loads of clubs and societies. They even shut down chess clubs because they don't want subversive ideas to spread. And there's the real sense from 1787, from this point, that the capital is, dare I say, a tinderbox, Tom?
Or is it more than a tinderbox? Has it already slipped royal control?
I think to some degree it has slipped royal control, actually. And I think from 1787 all the way through to 1789, it's a question of trying to regain royal control. And there are troops on the streets, pretty much all the time from this period.
Because there was the Queen being forbidden by the King to go into Paris.
Right, exactly. So that's against this backdrop, isn't it? The hostility to Marie Antoinette. Absolutely.
Yeah.
So the months pass very uneasily. And then in April 1788, Brienne just unveils a new plan to try and break the deadlock. And it's quite clever in a way. What he does is he will strip these courts, the Parlement, of their ability to kind of police royal edicts. He will beef up the powers of the courts below them, the lower courts. They'll take over a lot of the Parlement's power. And there'll be a new court set up, a plenary court, which will approve royal taxes. And obviously he will stuff that court with his people. And the Parlement will just be reduced to basically arbitrating disputes among the nobility, which is a pretty pitiful kind of thing for them to be doing. And again, there are massive riots in Paris. There's great outpouring of rage. But the interesting thing here, right, so much of the French Revolution story is told about Paris. And you just assume the rest of the country is being dragged along in Paris's wake. But that's not the case, because the worst riots about the Brienne's Parlement plan are in places like Lyon and Aix and Dijon. So provincial capitals where having a high court was very important to them.
I mean, it's not surprising, is it? Because we talked about how France is a much more geographically diffuse country than, say, Britain. And, well, actually, it's a bit like Scotland defending its distinctiveness against London.
Exactly. Yeah.
What makes you distinctive is incredibly important to you.
Yes. Imagine the government trying to scrap the courts in Scotland and saying, let's have just one British court. I mean, imagine that, how
or the
controversial.
Or the church or whatever, which was, yeah.
Exactly. Now, this brings us to the city where the French Revolution begins.
And it's an unexpected place, isn't it?
So I don't think the French Revolution begins in 1789. I think it begins in 1788. And I think it begins in Grenoble.
Yeah, so justify that, Dominic.
So, Grenoble, city in the foothills of the Alps, southeastern France. It calls itself the cradle of the revolution. That's how Grenoble brands itself to this day. It's a very ordinary place, which you might think makes it a weird place for the revolution to have begun. But no, the ordinariness is the point. That is precisely why the revolution begins in Grenoble. Grenoble is basically the capital of the province of Dauphiné. It's a long way from Paris. Its regional distinctiveness matters to it. And there's a parliament in Dauphiné, and there are loads of people associated with it. Lawyers, people, journalists, useless writers, all of this kind of thing.
Kind of people you get on Twitter.
Exactly that. People who spend all day sitting behind their computers firing off angry messages.
Yeah.
They owe their livelihoods to that court. If it is downgraded or removed, they will lose that. Also, Grenoble is a glove making centre. And they're very good at making gloves. They export them all over the world, to America, to Russia. But the glove-making business is in real trouble because all of these woes have led to an economic downturn and lots of people have been put out of work. So there's a lot of anger. So on Saturday the 7th of June, 1788, the day the French Revolution begins, Brienne has his edict read out in the marketplace. And it's market day, and he has troops go to basically take the Parlement leaders out of Grenoble, which is what he's trying to do across the kingdom, to take them out of their centres. And the law clerks come out and they start haranguing people and shouting at people in the marketplace. This is what's happening. Isn't this terrible? And it basically escalates from a protest to a general strike and then a huge riot. They close the city gates. They lay siege to the governor's house. The authorities send in soldiers, but not enough. People go up to the roofs of their houses and they get these tiles and they start bombarding the soldiers with tiles. So it goes down in history as the Day of the Tiles. The soldiers, as is so predictable, they lose their cool. They start shooting. They kill a 12-year-old boy and they kill a hatter. And then the crowd go ballistic. They're parading the blooded clothes of these people around. They start ringing the bells to summon peasants in from the countryside. Because it's market day, a lot of people have come in from the countryside already. So they're sailing to the peasants. Your relatives are under attack from the soldiers. Come and defend them quickly. So people are pouring into the city. Basically, the mob seizes the city. They sack the governor's house. Tom, you'll be gutted about this. They ransacked the governor's natural history cabinet.
I saw that. Yes. And they took a stuffed eagle. Yeah, I suppose you can't make an omelette without breaking eggs.
Well, of course, as famously, as it's been remarked on this podcast, they do not actually make the omelette.
So basically, there is an intra-elite attempt to kind of grab the levers of power. But essentially, that fight between the kind of rival sections of the elite has been overtaken by a mass uprising.
Yeah, it has. And actually, Simon Sharma is absolutely brilliant on this. It's one of the many, many fantastic insights in his book. And we shouldn't make this the Sharma fancast. But he points out the judges are carried aloft by the crowd, the Parliament judges. But he says it's not clear at this point. Are they the leaders? They're not the leaders of the riot. They're more like it's kind of its trophies, a bit like the stuffed eagle, but they're also kind of its prisoners.
Right, and this is something that will happen again and again. So, looking ahead, it's an experience that the royal family will soon be experiencing.
And some of the older judges are very anxious about this and end up actually leaving the city. They don't want to be associated with this. But there's a younger generation who are enthused and actually see in the disorder and the collapse of royal authority a chance to lead, to profit. And the classic example of this is a guy who I think you can argue is the first true French revolutionary leader. So he's a young judge from Grenoble, and he's called Jean-Joseph Munier. And he is just such a perfect example of a French revolutionary leader. He's the son of a cloth merchant. He's upwardly mobile. He's 29, so he's young, as so many of them were.
And
he's a lawyer.
Yeah.
They're all lawyers.
They're all lawyers, aren't they? They're all young lawyers.
And he's really ambitious. They're basically like our Athelstan members, Tom. They're young lawyers of the Rest is History Club. French revolutionaries in waiting. So he has bought the office of a royal judge, and he has actually become a he's on the lowest possible rank of the nobility.
And isn't that always the way, classically, in a revolution, that it's the people, it's not the poor, it's always the upwardly mobile who haven't got quite upwardly mobile enough.
Exactly. And he sees this as a chance to jump up the ladder and to turn the ladder into his ladder. So he convenes a huge meeting on the 21st of July, 1788, outside Grenoble at the Château de Vizelle. The Château de Vizelle, if you go there today, it is the world's only museum of the French Revolution, and there's a reason for that. Because you can argue again, this is one of the absolute places where the French Revolution began.
Well,
a year before
if you are the Grenoble Tourist Board.
If you're the Grenoble Tourist Board, exactly. And at this meeting, he says, listen, we want free elections. We want the States General of Dauphiné, each province to have its own Estates General. And when that's going to meet, and when that meets, the third estate, the Commons, should have the same numbers as the other two estates, the Lords and the clergy put together, and they should all sit in one chamber, not multiple chambers like they have in Britain, Lords and Commons, all one chamber, so that the Commons can dominate. In other words, majority rule, the general will dominate over the privileges of the old order. And a lot of historians say that is so groundbreaking and seismic that is the true kickoff point for the revolution, the chain of events that will lead to the revolution. And there's two other things that I think are really revealing about that meeting at Vizelle. First of all is the language is so 1793. It's all about patriotic fire, sacrifices. The law should be the expression of the general will. But the other thing is there is a darker side to it. So this, for the first time, these people say we are patriots, but our opponents are traitors to the patrie, and they should be treated accordingly.
Because there's a kind of incipiently totalitarian quality to saying that you are the embodiment of the nation.
Definitely there is, Tom.
Because if you are the embodiment of the nation, your enemies therefore aren't, and by definition are traitors.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. I totally agree. Now, of course, you can say there's a great irony here, that actually even Mounier and his friends have not really understood what happened in Grenoble that riotous day. They think, because they've been chaired aloft by the crowd, they think they're going to control it. And they are, of course, dead wrong. And some of these people are going to end up dead, literally dead. But I think what makes it so revealing is that it is indicative of this change in the language and the sentiment that is happening in 1788. Previously, all that stuff was about the old liberties of the French, that the government, a modernizing government, is trying to squash. But in 1788, you can see that language changing, and people are now saying, let's actually do something new. Who cares about the past? We can use this opportunity to draw up a new constitution. Sharma gives a brilliant example of a lawyer called Volney, who wrote a journal called The Sentinel of the People. What does it matter to us what our fathers have done, or how and why they have done it? The essential rights of man, his natural relations to his fellows in the state of society, these are the basis of any form of government. So in other words, that they're going to take that, the idea of starting again, and they take the passion, the idea of virtue, all of that. And that gives them, you could argue, what Robert Darnton calls a radically simplified view of politics.
And also it's very contrary to the way that the Constitution has evolved in Britain, where the whole point of the relationship of the monarchy to the House of Lords and the House of Commons has evolved over time and is rooted in the deep past.
Yeah.
And so therefore you can already see that Britain is starting to fade as a model for the more radical proponents of a new constitution.
But also what is so interesting is it is also different from the American constitution makers, because they're basically, the American constitution makers are slightly trapped within the British mindset. So it's about the separation of powers. They want to ensure against a kind of mob democracy. They want to ensure against somebody having too much power. It's kind of, their constitution is hedged about with kind of nuances and qualifications. The French revolutionists have no time for that. Sharma quotes a guy who was a friend of Rousseau's called the Comte d'Entraigues, who said, the people is the state itself. By the immutable laws of nature, the people is everything. Everything should be subordinated to the people. That is not how British Whig politicians spoke. It's not really how American colonists spoke. This sense of, it's very simple. There's us, the side of virtue and patriotism and liberty,
and the nation.
And then there's them, despotism and depredations and corruption and all of that sort of stuff, and traitors. So right there, even before the fall of the Bastille, you've got the lines being drawn very starkly. Now, meanwhile, Mr. Brienne, with his pustules, the Archbishop, is sitting there in Versailles thinking, what on earth am I going to do? And clearly everything is all kicked off. His plan hasn't really worked. And he says to Louis, listen, we do have to call the Estates General. We're going to have to do this. And Louis says to him, what, Archbishop? You must think we are lost. They might overturn the state and the monarchy. And Brienne says, I'm afraid we have no choice at all. So in the second week of August 1788, they go public and they say, we're going to call the Estates General. We'll figure out how it will work in due course. We don't really know what the rules will be, how it will be elected, but we will call it all the same.
What could possibly go wrong?
And then, against this background, a massive development. On the 16th of August, Brienne announces they have run out of money. They have been surviving all this time on loans, but the royal treasury is virtually empty. From now on, people will be paid in IOUs, in paper money, which they don't really believe exists. In other words, France is bankrupt.
Well, Dominic, what a cliffhanger. So in the next episode, the Estates General will be meeting. The revolution will be beginning, or you could, if you accept that it's already begun in Grenoble, it will be continuing. And if you just can't wait to find out what happens, you can hear it right now by joining the Rest is History Club at therestishistory.com. Alternatively, the next episode will be coming very soon. Either way, we'll see you then. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. It's a terrible storm. And, of course, if you've been listening to this series, which we hope you have, you will know that it strikes at the worst possible moment, when France is gripped by this political and financial crisis. And the storm is then followed by a drought across France, then suddenly a very hot summer. And farmers are writing to the court in Versailles, sending letters asking for help. A once ravishing countryside has been reduced to an arid desert. And there's a real sense of of catastrophe.
Is that an Arab?
That was Scottish again. There's a real sense of incipient catastrophe, which, of course, in the context of everything that we were talking about in the last episode, means that
it's not helpful, is it?
It's not helpful at all. The interesting thing, actually, is that last time we were talking about the Ancien Régime and the sort of how the stereotype of it is so misleading. And so it is with this case. You would think, if you had read A Tale of Two Cities and all of the sort of, you're used to the caricatures of the French Revolution and the French elite, that nobody did anything to help. And you would be wrong, because actually the Archbishop of Paris launches this big charity drive. The king gives 1 million livres, even though, the monarchy has pretty much run out of money. There's a national lottery is organized and it raises 12 million livres to pay for relief. But as we will see, it is not remotely enough to rescue the situation because, Tom, nature has more storms in store.
Wow. So the elements are combining against the monarchy.
They are indeed.
And the Ancien Régime
is in a mess, I think it's fair to say. Were you trying to think of a meteorological metaphor for the...
No, I've moved on from the meteorological metaphors. I was maybe thinking of a building one. I was thinking perhaps it's tottering on its foundations.
It is tottering on its foundations. Because as we discussed at the end of the last episode, something looking very much like a French Revolution has already broken out in Grenoble and in Dauphiné in the southeast of France and has spread to other provinces. Louis XVI, in desperation, has announced that he will call the Estates General. And we ended last time with the bombshell that Archbishop Brienne, the finance minister, has basically declared bankruptcy, his partial bankruptcy.
And it's ironic, isn't it? Because he doesn't believe in God, but all these acts of God have now.
Yes, ironically. Well, he didn't believe in the deficit, and then he was appointed to look at the books.
So he's on a learning curve.
Yes. Well, his learning curve is abruptly terminated a week later, on the 25th of August, when he is booted out, and the monarchy turned to the one person who everybody in France thinks can rescue the situation. This is the man we mentioned very briefly last time. His name is Jean-Jacques Necker. And he is not a courtier. He is not an aristocrat. He is not even French. He is a Swiss Protestant from a Genevan banking family, and he is meant to be the great financial whiz-kid of Western Europe.
Because the Swiss, even then, have a kind of reputation for sobriety and the kind of man that you would trust to sort out your bank balance.
Totally, they do. Yes, exactly. Necker is it seems odd now from our perspective, all these centuries later, to comprehend how a Swiss banker could be such a folk hero across France.
Yeah, I know.
But absolutely, there was a sense in France in the late 18th century that Protestants, although they are weird, alien and